You're listening to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
And we're your hosts for this show. It's a Monday, so you know what that means. We're probably reviewing something. And in this case, we're going back to Tales of the Jedi. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed our shows last week, because last week we did like 3 shows. We had our Tales of the Jedi review on Monday. We did a special Thanksgiving roundtable discussion about Kathleen Kennedy and her possible firing and all of that. And then, of course, Friday, we wrapped everything up with our Andor season finale reviews. So if you guys missed any of those shows, not now, of course, because we are live and we want you guys to watch tonight's show, but make sure that you go back and, definitely check out those shows. The other thing is, I just put up a poll about 10 or 15 minutes ago asking pretty much where you guys are landing on this Tales of the Jedi episode that we're going to talk about, Practice Makes Perfect. So, yeah, this episode was interesting. I didn't even take any notes on this one because it wasn't really a whole lot. Well, not only that, and I think it was really only 11 minutes of content, because don't forget, they have the whole intro stuff that they do, and sometimes they'll do a recap, and then I've noticed, and this is true with all the shows, there'll be 3 minutes or something left in the show, and the credits pop up. So it's not, going all the way to the end of the time, but I mean, the other reason was, even though there's a lot of really subtle things and everything in this episode. So right away, I don't know if David's going to like it. Because this is one of those episodes where really not a lot was happening. It was just kind of, okay, they did this
big exam.
Well, it was kind of like, obviously, the whole point of the episode was to show how Anakin's training was differing from the general training that they were getting in the Jedi Order. And I think it was doing 2 things. One, it was that, where it was basically a juxtaposition between the problems that the Jedi are facing and maybe why they're facing, because they're not really moving along. They're still training almost as if they're still at peace, not at war. And then, of course, the other thing was to show, how Anakin was different, and also how Ahsoka got so good so quickly. Because when we first meet her in season 1 of the Clone Wars, she's still relatively young, but she's fighting alongside him. And, she's vanquishing a lot of the enemies, too, even though she's 13 or something. So I think that they wanted to show a little bit of that as well. But yeah, this basically was the pick up the jacket, put down the jacket episode of Star Wars, because really, other than being bookended maybe by a little bit of story beforehand to show where you got there, the entire episode was just do it again, do it again, do it again. And as you said,
right,
it was really short. It was only maybe, I think the time said it was 15 minutes, but I think it was really only 11 or 12. So.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this episode. It didn't have as much weight as the last episode. However, it did carry some weight in the sense of a couple of things. One, even though very briefly, it showed the maturation of Anakin. It showed the relationship that he had with Obi-Wan, him running in. He's like, oh, I thought I was late. And he's like, yeah, you're right on time. I thought I was late. He's like, that's what I meant, So once again, you kind of see that the brotherhood that dynamic, there, that dynamic between those two. So I always love the fact that they kept that. And then the fact that Anakin is because you have to recall the whole reason why Yoda assigned Ahsoka to him in the first place was because it was to teach Anakin Like, okay, look, you can run around and do all this stuff because, you know, Obi-Wan's there. But what happens when you become Obi-Wan? And you have to now be responsible of this, this youngling basically that's under your care and watch. Like you have to now rein in this wild stallion, so to speak. And so although Anakin was like, okay, everybody else is so impressed by, what Ahsoka was able to do, and it looked flashy and cool, and she surpassed everybody's expectations. It didn't impress Anakin at all. And that's because Anakin knows what's out there. And he's like, look, that's all cool. But what happens if something else, like a Grievous or some, other machine or something comes up that's way more powerful than we've ever seen before?
Right.
What are you going to do then? And I love that aspect. I love the fact that he took it seriously, is where you saw the relationship with them in the beginning when he kind of pulled the same thing with that Obi-Wan did on him with her. Like, oh, you're right on time. That joke kept running, so that was
Yeah,
cool.
exactly. That was funny.
But but it got serious though, like once, she entered the circle, and it's like, all right, and he had that serious conversation with her, like, look, I'm your master, and the best thing I could do is to prepare you for anything. And I thought that was just like it's one of those heartfelt, touching moments that you don't normally see from Anakin, because he's usually kind of the jokester, and he kind of plays around, with her a lot. But at this moment, though, you can see that he was really like serious, and to see how they actually the best part about this episode, honestly, was to show how that training paid off.
Yeah, and I mean, this is basically what the whole point of the episode actually was, I think, is the fact that, yeah, you have a situation. Again, it was like you basically said in your thoughts, that this deceptively, I mean, if you're looking at Star Wars as on the surface some sort of an adventure type of a thing, this is another one of those episodes that's not going to appeal to you. It's not going to appeal to the people that want an action-packed, maybe Clone Wars style episode. It's
This is for the actual fan, though. This is
Yeah.
really not for the casual fan. This is
Right.
for like the hardcore fans.
Well, and I mean, honestly, I would, and I'm sure this is probably where you're going with it, but I would actually make the argument that this particular mini series is exactly that, right? It's for the more serious fans, not necessarily for the casual ones, because I think a lot of the reasons why Dave Filoni did this was a little bit of world building, filling in some canon that, was sort of loose canon. I mean, I just think that it's one of those things where you're really looking to add depth and richness to some of the stuff that's already there. And in this particular episode, there's just so much going on, even though it doesn't really look that way, because that's why I had to laugh, because when you really stop and think about it, all the episode really consisted of was her going up against the clone troopers, getting stunned, and doing it again. I mean, other than those few bookended scenes. And yet, there was so much in just the sparse dialogue between Anakin and Ahsoka during that time. Like one of the things I thought was really interesting was when, she kept getting knocked out or whatever, and he was like, yeah, but you got up a lot quicker this time, or whatever. I mean,
right.
It was Anakin being funny and being Anakin, but at the same time, he was making a point. And yeah, and the thing is that he was trying to tell her, like, listen, part of being successful is knowing how to fail. It's one of those things where it's not so much that you're avoiding and you're dodging everything, which is pretty much the point of when you're going up against the little droid orbs or whatever in the more traditional Jedi training, right? This is really more about you have to learn to take hits and then get back up again, because in a real war situation, you're not going to dodge them all. I mean, obviously,
and it's also teaching you humility and not to be so arrogant.
exactly.
Ahsoka kind of had that, like, okay, I wiped out all these droids.
Right.
That was easy.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, yeah, that's you know that's not one of those things that you can just gloss over. Like, you have to really be prepared for like anything in the heat of battle. And especially, like I said, I love the fact that, because when I first watched it, I said, all right, where are they going with this?
Right.
But to see them kind of tie it in to that very last episode or the last season of Clone Wars,
Mm-hmm.
where she had to defend, basically, like, it was her and Rex against like this army of clone
That
troopers.
was so
And
powerful. I actually had to rewatch
yeah,
that. I had to
and then
rewatch
like
that.
we
I didn't know what it was. I'm like,
oh, really?
yeah, like at first, it took me a minute for that to click because I knew based on just the music and kind of the way it was being set up or whatever, there was more gravitas to that scene, just
Mm-hmm.
the way that it was presented, and I caught that right away, and I'm like, oh, she's not just, this isn't part of the same timeline. I got to figure out what's going on. So I rewound it, and that's when I'm like, okay, now I understand what this
Mm-hmm.
is and where they're going. But it was, yeah, that probably was the coolest. And once again, this happened a little bit in the last episode, and it's maybe with the exception of the first episode, there's been little subtle hints of that throughout all, well, we're on episode 5.
Most.
So if you take episode 1 out, it's like all 4 of these, like these last 4 episodes, where there's a really big payoff, like a almost chill-inducing moment. And that was that one, where they tied it in perfectly to, now it's a different circumstance. She's really, truly at odds with these guys.
And she really
And
does have to literally fight
and
for her
she
life at
really
this
does
point.
have to fight for her life. And it's sort of like, it's ironic because it's also at the command of her former master who was teaching her that lesson in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Which, another thing, and then I'll get to David's comment, but another thing that I found interesting was, as I'm watching this, I kept reflecting back in my mind to the Ahsoka Vader duel in Rebels.
Mm.
Because a
Yeah.
lot of these lessons, obviously she was like way further along at that point, but you could see where some of these lessons and everything that Anakin was teaching her assisted her in that battle as well. And it was almost like a thing to like, wow, dude, what you're showing her now, she's going to use against you later. Because she has
Well,
to.
the cool thing was, yeah, well, the other part was the foreshadowing part that he dropped in there. I don't know if you caught it, but he was like, if you can if you can, hang off, pretty much hang out with Rex and his guys and survive, like, you'll be able to beat anybody. I mean, with a
Mm-hmm.
blaster. And it was
Yeah.
just like,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
that blaster
I did
part was
catch
like
that. Yeah.
it's like, all right, now you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about lightsabers, that's different. And that's
That's
where
a
you
little
run into
different.
him with the Vader confrontation that you just spoke of. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, that was really sweet. And I really love the writing of how they tied that in with that last episode. And like I said, hardcore fans would get that.
Yeah.
Or you at least in your case recognize, like, wait a minute, I've seen this before. Where though? And so for those who have not watched the Clone Wars in its entirety, they wouldn't probably get that last scene.
Well,
But for those, and that's
yeah.
why I said it was more for the hardcore fans.
All right. Well, that wraps. No, I'm just.
Yeah, well,
It's
pretty
like
much.
almost. I mean, there's not a whole lot. Well, there is. Oh, and Ronaldo joined us. Hey, Ronaldo. I mean, there are some really weighty things to discuss in this, and because yeah, I started thinking about it. I was watching the episode, going, this might be a shorter podcast this week, 'cause, you could pretty much blow through everything
unless we
out
got
in
unless we
10
got a bunch of
minutes.
people
Unless we
writing
got a
into
bunch of
us.
people chatting, yeah. And again, I did put up a poll. I'm gonna start doing that, I think, before when we're reviewing a lot of these episodes. I mean, I really wish, we just got done reviewing Andor, and we're we're coming up on the end of our Tales of the Jedi review, but I'm going to start putting up polls in our community tab so you guys can basically vote on this stuff ahead of time, like what you thought of the episode or whatever, and then we can, read the results or whatever on the site during the stream. So I thought that might be fun, and it'll also be a good way of kicking things off, because obviously that's open to way more people than might actually watch this live, and I might even try to duplicate that on our Twitter page as well, because a lot of times when you actually get a pretty much like an overall consensus of some of this stuff, it really is amazing, because you really start to think about where people are coming from. And you actually brought this up again with the whole, this is for a more of a hardcore type fan, because if you didn't see the Clone Wars, even especially the last episode, I mean, I guess you could get away with, if you had just seen Attack of the Clones, you'll still get a lot out of it. Like the main points, I think you would get out of it. But there's a lot of filling in that they do with Dooku. And of course, when you and I mentioned Master and Apprentice and Jedi Lost, which were a couple of the books, that's when you really get enriched with the whole last episode. So let me get this comment from David. It says, "Hello, gentlemen. I'm so upset I missed the last episode." Yeah, I know, man. I mean, he said, "The show is a highlight of my Monday, Friday." Well, we actually definitely enjoy it when we appreciate that, but we also, that's right back at you, man. We appreciate the fact that when you come on the show, because sometimes you'll bring up some stuff, that we either didn't think of or whatever, and it actually makes for a good discussion. He says, "I enjoyed the episode. It was good. Not 12-0 good, but good. Side note, try to reach you, Daryl." Little side note.
12-0.
Now
the 12-0 is reference to the Michigan victory, of course.
I think we all, even I know that. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that the episode, I think you can look at it from the quality of the episode versus also a little bit more of the depth of the episode. Like I said, I think that people are going to fall into maybe one of three camps. This might be an oversimplification, but I think they're going to fall into one of three camps when they see this episode in particular. And again, take it within the context of the entire series. But I think you might get some people who will just somewhat dismiss the episode because at the surface it was fairly one-dimensional, right? Mm-hmm. It opens up, kind of sets up a thing, and then it's just Ahsoka getting up and failing and getting up and failing, and done. Credits. So not a whole lot going on as far as the wider universe, right? So I think you might get people like that. The second type are the people who maybe are a little bit more like David. Enjoyed the episode. Thought it was cool. Maybe not the greatest, but they got something out of it. They enjoyed it. And then there would be the third type. The type like us who can actually host a show based on this one episode.
Right.
Who can just basically talk for, a good amount of
one
time.
Scene and then
exactly. And just dissect it to death and, get all the subtext and everything from it and go on and on about, no, you don't understand. You guys are missing the point. That kind of thing. Right. And I think a lot of it depends on what you've seen outside of this, because this particular show, this series is actually filling in gaps. I mean, that's pretty much what this thing was about. And I don't know if they really did a good enough job marketing that fact. And to be honest, I don't know if you've read anything or not, but I haven't really read anything about the performance of this series. Like, I don't really know, how many people are into it. Well, not even that. Just like
season or
what's just the general reaction from the fans? Like, are people really into it? Is it Yeah, are they clamoring for a season 2? Is it relatively floating under the radar? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's probably going to float on the radar for most people, considering the length of the show, and then of course, it's not a cohesive story. It's not one of those like an Andor or Obi-Wan where you're following one main story that leads to somewhere.
Mhm.
This is just more like vignettes of characters that we're already familiar with, and we're just filling in
Right,
those
like,
gaps.
you might say it's kinda like Star Wars Visions, only interesting.
Exactly.
And actually making sense. Um, Ronaldo says, "I like this one, not amazing or anything, but fun." That's that's a good way of looking at it too. I didn't really
Hmm.
think about it, but really when you do stop and look at it, even though there are some really weighty things going on, it is kind of a fun episode. There's a lot of witty dialogue. There's um and there are moments where yes, you have, these really deep philosophical types of things. You have that incredible ending, which, if you really just stop and think about, is mind melting
Hmm.
because of what's going on. And again, I think that you're spot on when you say that in order to really get that, in order to really understand that, in order not to think that we're just really into this stuff in kind of a nerdy or geeky way, you really have to have seen Clone Wars season 7, particularly towards the end, because the interesting thing about season 7, for those who haven't seen it, is it doesn't just brush up or like overlap the beginning of episode 3. It goes deep, man. It overlaps the entire thing to where it's almost, and I use this reference a lot lately, a Lion King 1.5, but for Ahsoka and Rex. It's basically
Hmm.
episode 3 from their perspective, their point of view.
Yeah, it's definitely running parallel to the main story, and that's exactly
Exactly.
what you're getting. It's those parallel lines.
Mm-hmm. David says, Disney hasn't always validated its female heroes, so I greatly appreciated them showing her trying to get better. It's just telling us, oh my gosh, girl power. She's so brave and beautiful. This is true, but there is a lot of background to this, because again, and we've made this argument on previous shows. It's been a minute. It hasn't been anything
Hmm.
recent, although we brush on this every once in a while. But I remember there was a show in particular that we did maybe a year or so ago where Ahsoka is probably the most fully developed character in the Star Wars universe, because we have literally seen her from a really young age. I mean, other than maybe Anakin, because Anakin is kind of the same thing, right? We meet Anakin when he's 9
Right.
years old and we kind of follow him through. And Ahsoka is very much the same way. She's probably about like 12 years old, 13 maybe, when we first meet her in the first season, first episode of the Clone Wars. But unlike Anakin, she doesn't necessarily have this like crazy change. I mean, she goes through changes, obviously, but we see her then develop through the what became 7 seasons of the Clone Wars. Then we see her in Rebels. Then we're seeing her in The Mandalorian,
Hmm.
Book of Boba Fett. Like, we're literally seeing this person from 12 years old to like 40. And I mean, it's just mind numbing to think that you actually get this much development in a particular character. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is the fact that it is a female character, and she was created by Dave Filoni. And as a result, I think that obviously he's going to take very good care of his own character, but she's just really fleshed out. And so I think that that's a lot of it too.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. Ahsoka is by far one of the most developed, and I would say even more so than Anakin.
Oh,
Reason being is
absolutely.
because, um, to your point, we see Anakin in stages. So we saw him like, okay, episode 1, he's 9 years old. Episode 2, there's a lot of time is now he's about probably 17
19.
years old, 19,
Mm-hmm.
years old. Episode 3, now he's like 23, somewhere around there. All right. So we're getting him, and of course in the Clone Wars animation uh series, he doesn't really age much in that. So we only see him kind of like in these chunks as he gets older, and then of course he becomes Vader, and on it goes. But with Ahsoka, though, from the time we were introduced to her in the Clone Wars movie, she's about maybe 12 or 13 years old. Throughout the Clone Wars, and that's how many seasons? It was like 10 seasons of that? No, 7 seasons. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
7 seasons. So in those 7 seasons, we've literally watched her grow up.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, now you have the other shows like Rebels and all these other different mediums where she's just advanced in age. So we've literally watched this, like she's become like a little kid to us, and watching her grow into her womanhood, essentially. And to David's point, yeah, Star Wars does do a great job in validating their female characters. Princess Leia was the same way. It
Yep.
wasn't just, fall in love with her because she's a princess and she's beautiful. Like,
Or a
no,
damsel
Leia
in
actually
distress kind of thing,
yeah,
the
Leia actually
typical.
had depth and character, and she had a purpose. She's there for real. She's just not there for eye candy. She's
And this is
there
at a
to actually
time
get a
when,
job done.
right, and this is at a time when you didn't really see that in films
Right.
or whatever,
Exactly.
It was still kind of the damsel in distress kind of thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and then of course Padme and,
Padme was the same way.
Saj Ventress.
Yeah, I mean, a lot. Star Wars has done a lot with that. I think the only, even with Rey, even though some people feel like her powers were too advanced, which I can understand why they would. We didn't get a chance to really see that, but I mean, at least she still had purpose, and
Right.
it wasn't just because like, oh, we like Rey because she's gorgeous and she looks great in a bikini or something like that. Like,
Well,
she's
and the other
really
thing
out
is,
there doing
right,
something.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, the other thing I think you got to look to, in all fairness, is I don't necessarily know if, and this would be one of those good topical shows, I think, where if we really wanted to explore, if you wanted to say do a show on, is it the character that they did a disservice to, or was it the film itself? A lot of the mishandling of Rey and all this other stuff, or just problems with their character in general, you could actually link back to the writing of the movie. I mean,
I have an idea. This kind of goes piggyback on what you were saying. I think what we should do, maybe when we
producing on
have a
the air,
nice lull,
folks. Right?
when we nice have a lull in Star Wars news, I think we should take like the films and kind of talk about, especially like the original trilogy and the prequels. We can really dissect those and really talk about what made those films good, character development. So for people who may be new to Star Wars, this is why it's so revered, because some people may not truly understand or get it. But if we can put things into kind of a context, then maybe it's like, oh, okay, we're really truly getting into the characters, why Han Solo is the way that he is, what made this production, even though in 83 or something like that, what made that so cool for that time. And that might be fun.
Yeah, that would be cool. Or that might even be that might be good fodder for the stream, though. Because I'm always looking at the whole idea that we always threaten that we're gonna unleash all this extra content, and we have the whole buy me a coffee thing, which, I mean, we basically had some people contribute or whatever, but nobody actually became a member, and we do have packages for that, and one of them is like exclusive content or something. And then that, of course, was one of those things that I sort of packaged that and made it before I really thought about, well, yeah, what are we going to do? So it's one of those things that I'm trying to still balance. three things. Of course, obviously, we have the constant topics that we do for our live streams, reviews, news, general discussion stuff. And then maybe there's something that we do that's not live, that it's sort of like extra content that we can put on. And then what do you give as far as exclusive content that you can offer members who maybe want a little bit more? So there's a balance in that. But directly to your point, I remember we had actually, I know we said we were going to do it, and I don't remember, we probably didn't. Because our second episode, like our first episode was just us talking about how we got into Star Wars and basically introducing ourselves to the public at large, right? But the second episode that you and I ever did of this show, when it was still an audio podcast, was a review of The Last Jedi. And then, of course, we did a review of The Rise of Skywalker. But I think that's it. You know, we did a review of Solo as well. But we never actually went back. We said we were going to do it. At the time that we did that, we said, you know, it would probably be good if we went back and reviewed all the other films. And yeah, that would probably be good, because what you're talking about is sort of an analysis, really.
Yeah.
It's kind of a review and also an analysis of, you know, what made this film great, what were maybe some of the missteps. It's just like a whole big discussion that we can get into with our viewers. And
yeah, I'm sure they have some things that they liked and things that they disliked, and they want to purge their souls as well. So,
well, and that would be a really cool thing. I mean, but it would also be something that I would want to actually advertise, like, well in advance of us doing it, because, you know, I mean, there's times where we'll get a bunch of people chatting, but then there's also times where, you know, it's like Ronaldo. That's, you know, or sometimes there's been a couple of shows we've done where we've gotten no live chats at all. You know, it would suck to actually have this really cool, you know, of course, then again, you know, maybe it's a topic. I don't know. But we do encourage people, by the way, while you're hitting that like and subscribe button, to also put topic ideas in the comments section or even in the community tab. I think people can just post in the community. I don't know. Community tab, they just started releasing that to smaller channels, so we'll have to see. Let me get to some more chats. Ronaldo says, I don't know if I want a season 2. Maybe with Dooku, but I don't see what else you could do with Ahsoka.
I think they're just trying to say, I think this is a warm-up for the actual show. I think we're going to get more of that in her actual live-action depiction.
Well, yeah. I mean, and it's true, because Filoni's handling both of it, so there could be a little bit of a reason why the first episode of this show, which was still an anomaly, is just kind of how Ahsoka became a Jedi. And then you have a bunch of Dooku-centric episodes, and then you have how Ahsoka maybe got to the next level, let's say, of her training. So it'll be interesting. I mean, we got one more episode left. You have obviously seen that. I have not. I don't know. We'll have to see. David says, damsel in distress. Sounds like Bix. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's kind of interesting about that, because that's something else going, and this goes back to the whole how they handle female characters in Star Wars point. What I really liked about the Bix character is the fact that you had a situation where she was a pretty strong character, actually, but she wound up in a very, very vulnerable position. And, I mean, she basically paid the price. Now, you could say that her strength lied in the fact that, you know, she didn't really... Was it implied that she broke? Or not? Because I remember there was that whole thing where everybody was worried about it, but I don't think she did, because it wasn't like she gave up the location of Andor or anything.
No, I don't think so. Bix, though, her parallel, though, it reminds me a lot of Leia, though, because if you kind of recall, like, Leia, you know, you kept hearing, like, oh, you know, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you know, you're my only hope. You know, she sounded like the damsel in distress.
Right.
I mean, now, granted, I will give her, she has some spunk talking to her father, I mean, Vader, on aboard Tandem 4. I mean Tandem 5, but um, we really didn't get a chance to really um see Princess Leia kind of really come into her own until she got aboard the Death Star and she kind of started talking back to Tarkin, and then so you kind of see, and Bix kind of did the same thing even with Deidre. Like she was kind of like, I'm not going to let you bully me. And then when she
Although,
got tortured, which Leia did,
mm-hmm,
that even Tarkin even said it, her resistance to the Mayan probe is considerable.
mm-hmm.
And Bix had the same thing. Like she's suffering, but she hasn't, at least according to us, she hasn't broke yet. So I think we're gonna see more of her in season 2 now that she's safe, and Andrew is probably going to meet up with her, and then I think it only could go up from there. But she does have a lot of parallels, in my opinion, to Leia.
Oh, no doubt. Although I will say, just this point of, like, it just has to be said. I mean, talking back to Tarkin and Vader is a little bit more intense than talking back to Deidre, though. However,
True story.
you could make the argument, though, that both. I mean, she might as well be Vader, right? Because she has her entire existence in her hands at this point. So, so then Ronaldo says, at least we saw Anakin actually teaching Ahsoka. It's a good point. That was another thing that I thought was, and he was talking about, he meant Clone Wars Ahsoka. He said her teenage story is already told. Let's focus on her adult years in Mandalorian and Rebels. And then he goes on to say, because I don't think we need to see what else she did as a kid. We've seen it all.
Absolutely. I agree with that. The
I
only part I
do.
disagree with is that, oh, you disagree. Oh, okay. Well, why do you disagree?
Well, I mean, when you started to say that you disagreed with that, I do too. Because there's always something, and it was something that you had said on another Ahsoka-centric show that we did a while ago. I don't even remember when it was, but it was something that stuck with me because I had actually made a similar argument to what Ronaldo was saying. And this very episode that we're reviewing now basically proves your point, is that there's a lot of pivotal moments that you could still talk about depending on what it is. I mean, I'd always said that the Clone Wars was this long stretch of time. And anytime people say, well, I think we got it, that's because we're going through all these major points in service to the Skywalker saga. Because remember, that's the lens that this story is being told through. But we don't necessarily get everything that happened, nor do we get all these other cool perspectives. Look at the whole last episode with the Dooku, the Yaddle, I mean, that was like extremely deep. And yet, for a couple of years now, at least, people are going, well, I don't know if we really need to see any more Clone Wars stuff. Hasn't that stuff been told to death, thanks to the Clone Wars series? Well, obviously not. Because we're still getting these really, really cool stories now. And as far as Ahsoka's concerned, like you, I agree with Ronaldo's statement in the sense of it's probably more interesting because if you look at her maybe at the point of Rebels, let's say, because in Rebels she's still, a little bit younger, obviously, maybe in her mid to late 20s, early 30s, somewhere in there. So there was a lot of growth that happened in between there, but it's a little bit more interesting now to see the more middle-aged Ahsoka, what's she doing around the time of Luke Skywalker. They kind of opened that can of worms with The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett. So now it's kind of like, well, you know what? Let's see where that goes now. So from that standpoint, I agree. But I wouldn't say that there's nothing really left to tell, though, from this other time period.
Well, and I agree with you because essentially I'm agreeing with me because that's what you base it off on.
Right.
Anyway.
Because if you disagreed with yourself, although it would make an interesting show, I don't know how healthy that would be.
But no, the only part I was disagreeing with Ronaldo for the most part was the fact that we seeing Anakin actually teaching her something, and it's like, no, he did that quite a bit actually. He did it quite a bit in the Clone Wars.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. And that's another thing. I mean, I think what he's talking about in this instance, and fortunately Ronaldo's watching, so he can obviously chat in and correct me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of this is like a more, I don't know, almost like intimate lesson, right? Like this is a little bit deeper than what we had seen in some of the Clone Wars, because now we're getting more into Anakin's style and philosophy, whereas in the Clone Wars, really, he's either just teaching her the general stuff that we've seen a lot of Padawans teaching their Jedi, or he's essentially putting his own spin on maybe some of the stuff that Obi-Wan would have taught him, and passing it on to her. I mean, there was some stuff like that whole like the brother, the sister, the father, that whole like force thing or whatever.
Yeah.
And I remember that was that whole point where Anakin had turned a little dark briefly and kind of gave us a glimpse into what he would eventually become. And Ahsoka was kind of freaking out. And then there was a point, I forgot what episode it was, but then there was a point where Ahsoka kind of turned a little dark at one point. And
she got possessed by that one spirit.
Yeah,
yeah. Freaky, man.
That's what it was. Yeah, she was kind of scary. Like dark side Ahsoka was a little terrifying, actually. So, there was. I think a lot of times people forget everything that the Clone Wars really covered, and I agree with you. I think that it would be good if you haven't seen the Clone Wars. I've always said like Clone Wars and Rebels at the minimum, because that's really the foundation of all these current storylines. I mean, you'll be a little lost if you don't at least understand some of that. But beyond that, if you have seen it, it's worth rewatching, because it's amazing how much stuff you actually forget. David says, yes, review the Star Wars movies. Maybe Daryl will learn what a good male lead is. And it's not Robert Pattinson, the Batman. He's still going to bring the Batman into it. I mean, he thinks Wakanda Forever is the best movie this year. Man, David's just kind of like got some Black Panther claws out on him.
Well, once again, I have to be the Jedi Master and spank him once again. But
I will say this, because I remember we were talking about the Batman, and this is one of these things that we actually used the Batman when we were talking about one of the Star Wars things not too long ago too, because once again, I'm not saying everybody, so I don't really know where David lands on this. But I will say this. A lot of people who don't like the Batman don't like it because they don't understand its source material.
I tried to tell them that, but, much like most Padawans, they just...
Well, you know what it is? You know what it is? A lot of people are used to either what they say. Because remember, I mean, the first... How old was I? I was 19 in 89. So in 89, when the Tim Burton Batman movie came out, the only Batman that we had seen any kind of live action or anything up until that point, obviously, it was the Adam West, Burt Ward, the 60s kind of campy version of Batman.
I mean, you want to take it further back to the 40s with the Serial series.
Exactly.
With Robert Lowry.
And even before that, there was one in like the 30s.
Or late 30s, yep.
Yeah.
39.
That actually even predated the 40s one. But of course, what predated everything was the comic series, right? The Batman, even more so than Spider-Man and Superman, because with Superman, he had the Gold Age, the Bronze Age, the Silver Age. Spider-Man, he had the Spectacular Spider-Man, the Amazing Spider-Man, and then just Ultimate. Spider-Man. And then, yes, Ultimate Spider-Man. So he had like 4 series of that. With Batman, what the Batman comic or the Batman movie was based on is actually the more Detective Comics starring Batman, which was one of the earliest comic series, which is what that 1940s TV show was based on.
Which is what DC Comics stands for.
Right. Exactly. And
I
and
digress.
again, I mean, see, and the thing is that I had the benefit because in the late 70s, early 80s, I was so into comics that I was one step away from officially trading them. But I had an encyclopedic knowledge of comics at that point. And even back then, yeah, that's like 40, 50 years ago almost. People really didn't understand the subtleties between the different variations. Even the suits were different.
Well, I think David's biggest complaint is that he just didn't like the actor. He feels like the actor didn't bring the gravitas to the character of Batman the way that he's normally depicted. He felt like he's physically too small to play the character. He felt like he was, emo, basically. Like, everybody kept calling him emo Batman. Like, he was just so super moody and everything like that. Those things. So
right. And
it's
like
more
you said,
so not
Robert
even
Pattinson is like a Sigma casted to play a Q-Dog. little fraternal stuff going here. Like Cassie, Michigan State to play the state of Michigan. Well, again, you had to understand that with the Detective Comics starring Batman, Batman was not a behemoth. In fact, if you go back and you look at, it was really only in more recent comics that they started making Batman bulked up almost like Superman, which is the Batman that you see in the Ben Affleck Batman, which, I think he's still probably my favorite Batman, even though I have the big soft spot for Michael Keaton. But I think as far as Batman acting like Batman, at least film-wise, Affleck was probably the closest. But, I mean, I understand, because, again, the same thing when I heard that Robert Pattinson was taking over, especially after Ben Affleck, I was like...
Oh, yeah, that too.
I'm like, wow, Edward? Because I'm instantly thinking of, Twilight, and I'm like, I don't know, man. This is... But I will say, if you actually compare it to the comics that are serving as a source material, it's with maybe a little variation. I mean, he kind of was like that. So, David says, see, Eric knows his Batmans. Yeah, because I'm like old as dirt.
Really, David? That's what okay. You wonder why I won't call him. See?
Exactly. Pretty soon it's like, wow, it's kind of weird. David's not right. Find out you went into the admin thing and blocked him. It's like, can't. So, a couple things from Ronaldo. First, he says Darkseid Ahsoka was horrifying. I absolutely agree.
Absolutely.
He says the Batman is awesome. Now,
I know, man.
Well, here's the problem, though, because he also loves Visions. So you might... You personally, me, I can kind of hang along with that, but you might have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, right? He also says you can also add the Long Halloween. Yes, the Long Halloween was another one, and I haven't actually. Oh, look at Ronaldo coming up in Batman Earth 1. I forgot about that one. Well, then there's also the Batman Beyond thing, which the Batman Beyond series is based on. That like futuristic one. So there's a lot. There is quite a bit of source material. And really with all the comics, and this is starting to affect Star Wars too, by the way. With the comic book films, whether it's DC or Marvel, because they've in essence rebooted a lot of these storylines with these heroes for so long. I mean, a perfect example is Superman, right? In the very beginnings, he couldn't fly. He just jumped really. And they would depict him jumping from city to city. So it was kind of like he was flying, but not really. And then, of course, as the years went on, the silver and gold and all that, you then started to get like all those like funky versions of kryptonite. At first, it was really basic. You had green, and then they kind of added... Then for a long time, it was red, green, and blue.
Red.
That was it. And that was, then they started coming up with like white and silver and gold and like all these crazy effects that it had on them. And yeah, it was it was really interesting. But a lot of it just depends on, as a film franchise, you have to basically decide what are you going to use as your source material. And with Star Wars, it's not so much that, because the source material was created and then they're just expanding. With Star Wars, you have to start to look at, are you going to, if you make a new series, are you going to approach it from the standpoint of looking through the lens of the Skywalkers? Or are you going to cover that same time period, but maybe another point of view, which is in essence what Clone Wars Season 7 was? Or do you take the route that some of the books have and you just start anew, like in the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, for instance? So there's a lot of different things that you can get from this. And so far with this series, of course, next Monday we're going to be doing the final episode of Tales of the Jedi.
Mm-hmm.
But, and again, I think the next episode that we do with that, we can really start to talk about maybe the series as a whole a little bit more. I could do it now, but I hesitate to do it because I want to get that last episode to get everything in totality. But I think that it's clear, just from what I've seen in, let's face it, 90% of the episodes that we're seeing, they're basically just trying to fill in the gaps. You know, they're trying to fill in some of the storylines, give us some more detail, enrich the stories that are already there, and pretty much go from there.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Honestly, that's really the whole gist of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so if you're to give your final thoughts, I mean, I'm amazed that we've actually been able to even talk. Like, we've been going pretty much our usual length, which I would have sworn up and down that there was no way in the world that we were going to do that. Of course, we did spend a little chunk on that talking about Batman, though.
Batman, that's right, exactly.
So I guess, hey,
little 10-minute break.
We did the same thing as the episode, right? We gave a little bit of filler to fill in and enrich the rest of the episode. I mean, it makes sense. So Ronaldo's already weighing in. We'll get to his in a second. What are your final thoughts, your rating? You know the drill.
Yep. Final thoughts on this episode. Once again, I enjoyed all of these, honestly. There's not one I don't like, so I can just kind of get that out the way.
A little preview for the next one.
Exactly. But I think for this one, it was really cool just because I love the tie-in at the very end. Like it led me somewhere, and that's what I really appreciated. And then of course all the little nuanced things that I said earlier. So I think, I'll give this a solid 8.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna do that too, because again, I gave the last episode a 9 because the last episode just had pretty much everything that you would want. At least I think I gave it a 9. I know I gave it at least a 9. And this episode, again, that ending, I think, put it up a notch. Without that ending, I might have given it a 7.
Right.
But other than that, yeah, I think that I agree, man. I think it was a solid episode. I think it gave us some additional knowledge and really filled in that whole Ahsoka Anakin storyline and gave us a little bit more into their training, and then of course, yeah, the tie-in at the end was just incredible. In fact, I probably didn't talk about that enough, honestly. Ronaldo says I give this one also an 8 out of 10. So we seem to be in agreement. All right. So now David's going to give us a little bit on the whole Andor thing. But David, you got to give us your thoughts on tonight's episode, though. You're like the missing piece right now. Well, while you're doing that, we'll get to this. He says, in retrospect, is Andor a cough above average? Do great moments justify the lethargic pace? Overall, are you all being overly gracious in your rating? Ooh, you haven't been watching our show for very long. I invite you to go back to our Rise of Skywalker review if you think that we're overly gracious in our ratings. I also invite you to go watch our Star Wars Visions reviews if you think we're overly gracious in our ratings. No, I mean, well, I think it really depends on, again, because, and I've said this time and time and time again, I think it really depends on what you're looking for from a particular show and what that show is trying to do. And oftentimes when you're trying to forge somewhat new ground, whereas most traditional Star Wars is sci-fi fantasy, Andor was really straight up sci-fi. And even that, it was really more like sci-fi elements. You know, it really wasn't designed to be some sort of a action-packed, you know, type of a thing. It was really more like what Stanley Kubrick or somebody would have done. You know, it's really more like the film student version, I guess. And I think that there's a lot that you can get from it. You know, I mean, yeah, it was incredibly above average. I mean, the writing was just ridiculously good. I mean, and again, it's not, the beautiful thing about films, television shows, all that, is they're going to land at different spots with different people. You know, everybody's going to have, I remember John Campea always says this on his show, it's where it's kind of like, there's things that Campea loves that, you know, some of the people when they chat in, it just doesn't land with them. And it's like, that's part of what makes this whole thing so great, is that everybody gets different things and has, you know, different views or whatever. And there's the objective and the subjective. And subjective, obviously, is, you know, how you feel, your opinion, and all this other stuff. And we give ours. But we also try to look objectively at things. And I remember you and I did this a lot with Visions. Because there were a couple episodes of Visions that we just tore apart. Actually, there's been a lot of things in this that we've just shredded brutally. To the point where we've actually ended shows where I'm kind of like, man, you know, did we go... Because I started thinking about, did we alienate anybody? Because we just tore into it so much. And I remember there's a couple episodes of Visions that we were kind of like, okay, we hated this is garbage. We can't stand this. However, and that's when we flipped it around to the objective point of view, where, okay, if you take your own opinion out of it, right, and you just base it on its own merit, where does it fall there? And so far we've been able to do both, which is good.
Yeah.
You know, and we try to do that. Now, David also chats in, tonight's Jedi is a 7 to 8. So he's pretty much landing in the same spot that we're all landing on this one, is that we're kind of doing that. He says, I'm becoming a fan of her. I love seeing a young Vader. A lot of fighting action. It's classic Star Wars. Yeah, well, and that's basically the thing, is that Ahsoka was a character that I hated. I mean, we weren't around, but I remember, you know, speaking of shredding stuff.
Oh my goodness.
Oh man, I obliterated the first episode of Clone Wars. And I remember, you know, going into the theater with Sky Guy and R2E and all this other stuff. And, you know, I mean, I was just like, man. And I was really excited about it, too, because you have to understand the scene. Okay, 2005, Revenge of the Sith is released. And Lucas basically says, okay, I'm done with Star Wars now. I'm not going to make 7, 8, and 9. That was the last Star Wars project that I'm doing. And that's it. You flash forward the next year, they announced that, okay, he's going to make this Clone Wars animated series, and he's going to debut the first 2 episodes. They're basically like a 2-parter. He's going to debut them in the theater. And I remember you and I went because we were so excited, like, wow, We never thought that we were ever going to see Star Wars in a theater again. And here we are.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm watching. And I'm liking some of it. And then Ahsoka comes on. And I'm telling you, she was like the new Jar Jar. It was nails on a chalkboard for me. I'm like, who is this chick? Like, why is she even there? I want to see Obi-Wan and Anakin. You know, I don't care about some preteen little girl pretending to be a Jedi. That doesn't interest me. So, I mean, it was just so funny, man. And again, you know, I had to admit that over time, she has become one of my favorite characters of the entire franchise. And that took a lot. And that says a lot, you know, because I hated her. You can attest to that. I could not stand her. And here's another thing that's funny while we're on the subject. When I rewatched the Clone Wars not too long ago, and then I saw episode 1, it wasn't as bad to me. And that's because I had the context of the rest of the series.
Yeah, you know what she became, so.
I knew what she became, and and I mean, just a lot of the things that bothered me about it, and I think it's because my expectations were a little bit different. Chair was falling here. So, again, and I think that that's something you have to look at, too, is a lot of times things will land differently with you depending on the mood you're in, where you're at in life, or if you're looking at an in-universe thing, like in this case, when you see things in totality, you could go back and appreciate the stuff. Ronaldo says the first appearance of Ahsoka wasn't really good. Yeah, that's an understatement. It was terrible. But he says, I always loved the Sky Guy name. I mean, a lot of it, again, because when I saw the episode again, when I watched it, or I should say when I was watching it again, and this is after, I'm trying to remember if this is before or after episode, or season 7. Because season 5 was the last official episode. Then they created a season 6. Because, you know, you have to remember the Clone Wars is like 22 to 24 episodes per season. It's like an old-fashioned season. And when Disney bought Lucasfilm and they decided not to do it or whatever, they basically had they had like 12 or something episodes that they were able to finish, and then they put out as a season 6. And it wasn't that satisfying, and that's why Filoni went back and did season 7, because he wanted to end it properly. He wanted to give Clone Wars the proper ending and send-off that he, and quite frankly, all the fans felt it deserved. So, yeah, that was quite interesting. But again, we are reviewing Tales of the Jedi after all. And what did you guys think? I mean, given Ahsoka and her whole story, do you guys think that this enriched the story? Did it give you a little bit more insight into the Anakin Ahsoka relationship? Did you guys like that, or was it a simple case of, I didn't really need it? You know, what did you guys think? And don't forget to take our poll that's on our channel right now, because we just basically want to get a little bit of a feel on what you guys thought of this episode and everything else. And of course, as always, if you enjoyed the episode, hit the like button. And hit the subscribe button if you haven't already subscribed to the channel. We'd love to have you guys as part of our community. Don't forget, we are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at HeadToHeadSW. And we have a Facebook group, Head to Head Star Wars Community, which I know Ronaldo recently joined. I think David recently joined. So there's been a couple people that have actually joined, and we do continue the discussion on there if people want to engage us there or on Twitter or whatever. That's always fine. And, I mean, I haven't really mentioned it much lately, but if you guys want to support us and do the Buy Me a Coffee thing, there's a link in the description. It's in the description of every one of our shows. So we're always happy for the support. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. You know, I'm never consistent in all the stuff that, I'm kind of a bad YouTuber that way, actually. I'm never really consistent in the whole outro stuff because, again, we're not trying to do a scripted show here. This is like a hanging out with our friends, you guys. But so I covered the whole liking and subscribing. It's like I got to actually think about this stuff now.
You got your checkoff list.
Yeah, no, I have my checkoff list. Friday, we'll probably end up doing a pre-recorded episode. Not sure what it's going to be, though, because we're done with Andor. Which actually leads me to the final thing that I wanted to say before we actually take off. And that is, if you guys do have topic suggestions, leave them in the comments section. We read all of our comments. We usually respond to all of our comments. And if you guys have something that you would like to see us cover or whatever, any Star Wars related topic, let us know. And we'll definitely put that in the queue and try to work it around all the Star Wars news that's constantly coming out. Oh, and David had chatted in, how do you buy a coffee? Well, link in the description. All right, so with that, we will see you guys in some form Friday, and then again, next Monday, 8 o'clock, we'll be reviewing the final episode of Season 1 of Tales of the Jedi, so you're not going to want to miss that. So with that, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.